Kulturna baština, zajednička i nezamjenjiva veza između ljudi i njihovih predaka. Presudna za osjećaj identiteta i društvenog pamćenja, kulturna dobra predstavljaju svaku pokretninu ili nekretninu od velike važnosti za kulturnu baštinu svakog naroda.
Includes monuments, historic monuments, architectural monuments, works of arts, archaeological sites, books, manuscripts, etc. There is a long list.
Kulturna baština često se nalazi na prvoj crti sukoba i namjerno se uništava kako bi se udarilo u kolektivno srce zajednice.
It is an attack at the cultural heritage of the others. It's hitting the heart of their identity because the identity of peoples are related to their origins, their heritage, their culture, both the tangible and the intangible cultures.
Gospodari rata su od pamtivijeka nastojali uništiti dijelove povijesti svojih neprijatelja, uništavajući njihova kulturna dobra.
It's part of not just individual countries' identities, but it's part of all our history. And we can't let people just vandalize it willy-nilly because they want to eliminate that part of history.
Potreba za kriminaliziranjem i kažnjavanjem pustošenja kulturne baštine prepoznata je od početka kodificiranja međunarodnog prava ratovanja.
Protection of culture and property has been a concern for international law since its very beginning, the very early stages of its development. More relevant to present times is the time when the laws of wars were codified in late 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. Cultural property then was protected by a general provision protecting the property of warring parties. There were special provisions protecting cultural property in sieges and bombardment. The states parties to the Hague regulations of 1907 were asked to spare as far as possible cultural property in such circumstances. This convention, the Hague regulations of 1907, apply still today as part of customary international law.
Before the Second World War, there were attempts in the 1920s through the Institute of Intellectual Cooperation to create a shared understanding about culture and heritage. There were also in different countries laws to protect monuments that developed already in the 19th century, both for nature protection and for cultural heritage protection.
Unatoč tim prvim pokušajima razvijanja sustava zaštite, tijekom oba svjetska rata došlo je do masovnog pustošenja i pljačke kulturnih dobara. Nakon Drugog svjetskog rata na sudu u Nürnbergu optuženo je nekoliko nacističkih dužnosnika za ratne zločine protiv kulturnih dobara, što je postavilo važan presedan za kasnije kaznene progone.
To utilize international law to meet the greatest menace of our times.
The International Military Tribunal, or as we know it, the Nuremberg Tribunal, dealt with crimes against cultural property. It also dealt with a lot of other crimes, so it was not, cultural property was not a big part of the issues it addressed, but nevertheless it addressed. It tried several high-level Nazi officials for crimes against cultural property. The most prominent of them is Alfred Rosenberg.
Užasnuta razaranjem do kojeg je došlo tijekom Drugog svjetskog rata, međunarodna zajednica pojačala je napore da definira i zaštiti kulturnu baštinu za vrijeme sukoba.
Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed.
UNESCO was created after the Second World War in 1945, and it is actually to build peace in the minds of men, because this is the way to address war. And it's a specialized agency in the United Nations system. dealing with science, education, culture, and communication. So culture is a core area, and all of this is framed in terms of sustainable development, because culture is a fundamental part of identity of people.
One of the most important developments is probably the adoption of the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in Times of an Armed Conflict. The preamble to the 1954 Hague Convention clearly states that destruction or damage to cultural property belonging to any people means damage to cultural property belonging to all mankind. International law protects cultural property in times of armed conflict.
Cultural property is protected unless it is being used for a military purpose, in which case it becomes a legitimate military target. So the principle is relatively clear, but as always, the application in fact can be very difficult. The evidentiary proof that cultural property has been targeted and was not being used for military purposes can sometimes be a difficult thing for a prosecutor to bring forward in a courtroom. And I think what is particularly difficult is proving what an attack, a shelling attack, was actually being directed towards when you have cultural property located in close proximity to military targets.
Kada je niz krvavih sukoba zadesio bivšu Jugoslaviju 90. godina 20. stoljeća, sustavno je uništeno na stotine vjerskih i kulturnih objekata, što je dobilo naziv kulturocid. Međunarodni kazneni sud za bivšu Jugoslaviju već je na svojim prvim suđenjima potvrdio da uništavanje kulturne baštine predstavlja zločin prema međunarodnom običajnom pravu.
I think it's important to remember that destruction of property has been a really integral feature of many of the ICTY cases. It's perhaps not such a well-known aspect that even apart from the cases that have focused extensively on property destruction, many of our cases have integrated property destruction alongside many other types of crime categories in the evidence that we've presented before the court. I think it's around 16 of our cases where there have indeed been instances of property destruction at issue in the proceedings before the court. That, of course, has given rise to a really rich body of jurisprudence on this issue, and I think it's another area where the ICTY has helped in establishing some very important precedents for the future in relation to these issues.
One of the first cases in which the tribunal dealt with crimes against cultural property, that was the case against Tihomir Blaskić, crimes in central Bosnia, in Lasva Valley. The accused was found responsible for destruction of mosques in 12 villages and towns. The trial chamber found that these acts constituted both a war crime and a crime against humanity. The same approach was taken in another case decided a year later. That's the case against Dario Kordic and Mario Serkeš. One of them was a politician and the other one was a military commander. It's again the same area of Bosnia, central Bosnia.
Oba raspravna vijeća donijela su odluke iz kojih proizlazi da namjerno uništavanje kulturnih dobara ima dodatnu težinu u usporedbi s napadima na civilne objekte zbog specifična duhovnog značaja za zajednicu.
The trial chamber reasoned in both cases that the destruction, these were specifically institutions dedicated to education and religion, the destruction of these buildings constituted an attack on the identity, on a cultural and religious identity of the individual and the people concerned, and for this reason it also considered that they can amount to the crime of persecutions.
Tribunal je također utvrdio da sustavni zločini protiv kulturnih dobara mogu predstavljati zločin protiv čovječnosti.
The trial chamber finds that there was a pattern of destruction and plunder in all the places attacked by the HVO, and that the HVO deliberately targeted mosques and other religious and educational institutions. All this was part of the common plan.
Raspravno vijeće je naglasilo sljedeće. To djelo, kada se počini s nužnom diskriminatornom namjerom, predstavlja napad na sam vjerski identitet naroda. Kao takav, on je gotovo čista manifestacija pojma zločina protiv čovječnosti, jer doista čitav ljudski rod je povrijeđen uništavanjem jedinstvene religijske kulture i za religiju vezanih kulturnih objekata.
So in many of our cases, we have included property damage as part of a persecution campaign as a crime against humanity. So I think that's been a really significant development because it forces us as prosecutors and the adjudicators of our cases to look in context at what is happening on the ground in a conflict and see the connections between a whole range of different acts, all carried out with a similar discriminatory purpose, and then apply one single legal category, persecution, to capture the harm that has been inflicted.
It was not obvious, it didn't follow directly from the statute that destruction of cultural property can be prosecuted as a crime against humanity. This was actually established by the jurisprudence of the Tribunal. And in one of the first cases, and this has been a practice followed ever since, ICTY definitely played a leading role in defining this field of law.
In our other cases, particularly the cases in Bosnia where we've charged a lot of cultural destruction, there might be a lot of it, but it was never the center of the investigation. Usually it was a case where we were looking into forcible transfer and murder and all the sorts of terror that go along with forcible transfer and deportation. And we said, yes, the people were killed, they were forced out. And then, along the way, we mentioned that, yes, once all of that was finished, or while it was going on, they destroyed dozens, if not hundreds, of mosques and churches.
Many cases at the ICTY have dealt with destruction of cultural property. In most of these cases, the destruction concerned institutions dedicated to religion or education, and the charge of destruction of this property was one of many.
Tijekom godina sucima tribunala predočeni su dokazi o oštećenju i uništenju nekih od najreprezentativnijih primjera kulturne i vjerske baštine.
The National Library is in the center of the old town in Sarajevo, at the bottom of the valley. It's located in the former Austro-Hungarian era city hall and therefore still referred to as Vijećnica Town Hall by Sarajevans. It had been the National Library since World War II and was to Bosnia what the British Library is in respect to Britain. It was the Library of Record. On the 25th of August, shortly after nightfall, it was bombarded from multiple locations from the Bosnian Serb army lines overlooking Sarajevo. Eyewitnesses described that it was hit by more than 40 incendiary shells, which caused intense fire. The fire brigade, and I talked to members of the fire brigade that were called out, found itself under fire with anti-personnel weapons such as heavy machine guns. The city water supply had been cut off just prior to the shelling, and in short, the building burned for nearly 3 days, and close to 90% of the collection was destroyed.
What quantity of books were destroyed in that fire?
The estimate is close to 1.5 million volumes.
Poštovani sude, draga gospodo, stari most je uništen 8.11. a pao je 9.11. u 10.15. On je uništen 8.11. Gađan je 4 puta u 4 navrata, cijeli dan. 4. granatiranje. Kad sam ja bio u Radobulji, sliku, njega je za taj dan pogodilo između 60 ili 70 granata. tako da se navečer kad smo mi došli nije moglo preći preko njega. Ja sam pokušao i vratio sam se. Pravo je čudo kako je izdržao cijelu noć. Sutra 9. ujutru tank je ponovo upalio 5 granata. Na 6. granatu most je pao.
I looked around me and it was clear there was a considerable amount of damage or desecration had been done to the inside of the monastery. As I recall, the wooden confessional booth had been smashed up and burned. Several of the wooden seats had been smashed, and there was human excrement smeared on the rest. There had been pots of paint thrown at the large fresco on the wall, and Arabic slogans had been written on the walls in spray paint. And finally, an attempt had been made to hack the fresco from the wall with something like a pickaxe or a shovel, and there were large pieces of plaster and dirt on the floor where this had happened. It was clear to me that there'd been a substantial amount of desecration of this particular religious building.
Dokazi o sustavnom uništavanju ustanova namijenjenih religiji ili obrazovanju imali su značajnu ulogu u osuđujućim presudama nekoliko političkih dužnosnika za organiziranje kampanja progona u Bosni i Hercegovini, Hrvatskoj i na Kosovu.
We've mentioned Blaskić, Kordić and Serkić. There's also Nelitilić and Martinović and later Perlić, Brdjanin and Stakić dealing with destructions of mosques in the autonomous region of Krajina in Republika Srpska.
The trial chamber found that the campaign of persecutions against Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats included killings, torture, physical violence, rapes and sexual assaults, constant humiliation and degradation, destruction and appropriation of non-Serb property, destruction of institutions dedicated to religion, deportation and forcible transfer, and the denial of fundamental rights, namely the denial of the fundamental rights to employment and freedom of movement, and the rights to proper medical care and proper judicial process.
Beginning in April, Serb forces attacked Muslims and Croats living in towns, villages and smaller settlements, most of which were undefended and contained no military targets. Muslims and Croats were mistreated and killed. Men were often arrested and taken to detention centers, while women and children were forced to leave their homes and were either detained or forced to leave the municipality. Their homes were then either looted and destroyed by Serb forces or appropriated by Serb authorities. Serb forces also destroyed cultural monuments and sacred sites of importance to the Muslim and Croat populations.
The trial chamber has found that all crimes charged in the indictment, with the exception of extermination under count 2, were committed in the South Krajina and the RSK from August 1991 through 1995, including murder, imprisonment, torture, cruel treatment, destruction, including of buildings dedicated to religion, as well as plunder.
Also, some of the Kosovo cases, the Milosevic indictment, the indictment against Sajnovic et al., against Vlastimir Đorđević.
Applying the legal elements of the crimes charged in the indictment to the facts found proved in relation to each of the 13 municipalities, the trial chamber finds that the crimes of deportation, a crime against humanity, other inhumane acts, forcible transfer, a crime against humanity. Murder, a violation of the laws or customs of war, and a crime against humanity. And murder, sexual assault, and wanton destruction of or damage to religious property as forms of persecution on ethnic grounds were committed by VJ and MUP forces in many of the locations alleged in the indictment.
Osim toga, tribunal je potvrdio da uništavanje kulturne baštine može biti korišteno za dokazivanje postojanja namjere ili mens rea da se počini genocid. Unatoč tome što definicija tog zločina ne obuhvaća uništavanje imovine, raspravno vijeće u postupku protiv Radislava Krstića napomenulo je sljedeće. Tamo gdje je na djelu fizičko ili biološko uništenje, često su prisutni istovremeni napadi na kulturnu i vjersku baštinu, kao i na simbole ciljane grupe, napadi koji se s punim pravom mogu smatrati dokazom namjere da se grupa fizički uništi.
So looking forward, we see, of course, terrible examples of cultural destruction in many conflict zones around the world, from Mali to Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. It's really prevalent and not surprising because it is so often integral to a broader campaign of targeting a community group, an ethnic group, a religious or racial group. And I think we really also can draw lessons from our work in terms of preventing these crimes too, because we can see that property destruction and cultural property destruction in particular is often an early warning sign that things are at risk of escalating to the point of persecution or indeed genocide.
Uništavanje kulturne baštine imalo je središnje mjesto u postupku koji je pred tribunalom vođen za zločine počinjene tijekom opsade hrvatskog grada Dubrovnika 1991. godine.
The Dubrovnik cases are the only cases at the ICTY which focus where the destruction of cultural property is, the center of the case.
There's no question that what captured the world's attention in relation to Dubrovnik was this wanton shelling of what was already at that point in time a UNESCO World Heritage listed site.
Dubrovnik je procvjetao tijekom srednjeg vijeka sa izgradnjom brodova i sa velikom trgovinom i tijekom 16. odnosno 17. i 18. stoljeća kasnije doživljava jako veliki procvat.
It's like an Italian city-state. I mean, it was always functioned like an Italian city-state, but further east, they speak a Slavic language. They were sitting as the intermediary between the West and the Ottoman Empire and got gloriously rich doing it, which is why they produced all that beautiful architecture. And even the bad things that happened to them made the city more beautiful.
Jedina velika nesreća i veliki disgracion, kako bi rekli, u Dubrovniku se dogodio 1667. godine, kada je Dubrovnik zadesio vrlo jaki i strašan potres i nakon kojega je vladao 24-dnevni požar koji je poharao i uništio ono što je eventualno od potresa bilo ostalo. Stoga su Dubrovčani morali upregnuti sve svoje snage da bi grad ponovno izgradili od kamena i dijelom kakav ga vidite danas. Doveli su i strane umjetnike, izgradile su se palače, podigle su se zidine koje i danas možemo vidjeti u ovome obliku.
They had that horrible earthquake in the 17th century, and as a result of that you have all of this marvelously consistent Baroque architecture which was built right after the earthquake. And even though the city declined economically, that also made it a more remarkable place because unlike other big ports like Split and Rijeka, which continue to serve as ports, Dubrovnik's old city was preserved as it was. And that's what makes it a really, really remarkable place.
Dubrovnik was included in the World Heritage List in 1979. As the pearl of the Adriatic Sea, and it was mainly included for its Renaissance and Baroque features. That means churches, places, different buildings, showing the evolution in the style of architecture. So it was included on the World Heritage List under criteria 2, 3, and 4 in 1979 as one of the first sites in the whole Mediterranean area.
Nakon toga nas prati povijest kroz više Jugoslavija, kroz 19. i 20. stoljeće, da bismo došli pred kraj i skoro pa početak 21. stoljeća kada je Dubrovnik doživio jednu od najvećih agresija u stvari u cijeloj svojoj povijesti.
U ljeto 1991. godine, nakon što je Hrvatska proglasila neovisnost od Jugoslavije, jugoslavenska vojska i hrvatski Srbi započeli su niz borbenih operacija protiv hrvatskih snaga. Do početka jeseni sukob se proširio na velike dijelove Hrvatske, uključujući Dubrovnik.
1. listopada 1991. godine počeo je napad na Dubrovnik. Vrlo rano su nas probudile eksplozije. U to vrijeme je cilj napada bio antenski sustav na Srđu, ali i u drugim dijelovima grada. Izvan uže cjeline grada napadana je recimo trafostanica, glavna trafostanica u rijeci Dubrovačkoj, zbog čega je Dubrovnik ostao bez struje, potom bez vode. Mi smo u stanu ostali bez telefonske veze.
Raketirali su odašiljač na Srđu i mislili su sa televizijom je gotovo i slike neće izlaziti iz Dubrovnika. Međutim, mi smo uspijevali slati sliku na razne načine.
Radija Herceg Novog objavljena mobilizacija teritorijalne obrane.
Bila je loša, ali je dolazila isti dan i ja znam da su druga strana divljala kad je vidjela da slika ipak nekako curi iz Dubrovnika. Jer njima je bilo jasno što znači slika iz Dubrovnika, jer kad su uvjetno deblokirali luku 15. listopada, druga ili treća točka je bila novinarima ulaz zabranjen u Dubrovnik, a tek 4. zabranjen ulazak osobama naoružanim i tako. Znači, njima važnije da novinare ne ulaze jer su znali što će značiti i što rade Dubrovniku i što će značiti ako ta slika izađe.
The blockade was announced on the 30th of September, and that's also when airstrikes took place and the cutting off of power and electricity. Followed the next day by ground operations from territories in Bosnia and Montenegro into the vicinity to capture land and to secure the area around Dubrovnik.
The JNA had been taking territory from the southeast of Dubrovnik, Konavle, and they also came in up above to the northwest and cut off the city. And in those areas they occupied, particularly in Konavle, the villages to the southeast of Dubrovnik, where the airport is. People fled from those villages. About 15,000 people were forced out of their homes in that area.
There were a number of people who had been displaced from their villages, and they had accommodated themselves either in the old city or in villages, including Savtat, where they felt that they were safe or safer.
The majority of the refugees that we saw were, well, they were civilians, they were elderly or women and children. When you occasionally we'd be filming in shelters when the bombardment was happening overhead, and that for people was always the time when you could see on their faces that they were terrified, was having heard the original bang and then waiting for that whistle and then the silence and wondering where the explosion was going to be.
Bilo je iznimno pomalo i groteskno jer su ljudi mislili ako uđu u zidine da neće im se ništa dogoditi. Čak se neko vrijeme navečer zatvarala i gradska vrata kao zidine i spomenici će nas zaštititi. Međutim, dogodilo se ono što se dogodilo. U par navrata prvi put su negdje potkraj 10. mjeseca prve granate pale na grad. Druga strana je govorila da je to slučajno, ali kasnije se vidjelo da zapravo to nije slučajno.
It was now impossible for the thousands trapped here to escape the bombardment. Threats of sanctions have made no difference to the federal army. If anything, the fighting has escalated since the late...
Međunarodna zajednica svakodnevno je s velikom zabrinutošću dobijala vijesti o borbama oko Dubrovnika i poduzimala mjere da istakne zaštićeni status starog grada.
So when the bombing happened in 1991, there was a meeting of the World Heritage Committee in Carthage in Tunisia. And the committee was informed about the situation. And there was actually quite a debate also behind the scene what to do in this case. At the time it was not Croatia, it was Yugoslavia, and the observer from Yugoslavia had some reservations, but the World Heritage Committee decided on the spot to include it on the World Heritage in Danger list in compliance with Article 11.4 of the World Heritage Convention, which says that it's the international community as a whole also to save those sites which are under threat. And this was a very specific threat, the bombing and the shelling of Dubrovnik.
My specific mandate in Dubrovnik, in the framework of the World Heritage Convention and also the Hague Convention of 1954 on cultural heritage in time of war, was to ascertain if any military damage or damage had been done from military causes to the old town of Dubrovnik.
I'd like to turn your attention to the old town in the month of October. Are you aware of anything happening to the old town in the month of October as a result of this shelling that you mentioned?
U starom gradu stanovnici Dubrovnika su mislili, pošto je Dubrovnik stari grad 1000 godina bio zaštićen pod UNESCO-om. A onda su ljudi, normalno razumni ljudi su mislili da ništa neće po gradu padati, pucati. Međutim, jednog dana je pala jedna granata u Boškovićevu ulicu.
With the officials of the city, we went around and we had 3 United Nations flags, and we hauled these 3 flags over 3 bastions of the walls of Dubrovnik, on Fort Mincheta, on the bastion Fort St. John, and also Fort Bokar. There were a certain number of Hague Convention signs which were placed on individual monuments in the old town.
In many ways, the thing that appeared to be there to protect the city, if only symbolically as it turned out, were the flags. There were flags flying over the city, very visible, very, very large, I mean, almost unreally large flags flying over the city. Pale blue with the United Nations motif on them, but basically saying from the first time you saw them that this is a protected site.
Početkom prosinca 1991. vođeni su pregovori u pokušaju da se riješi problem blokade Dubrovnika. Hrvatska delegacija na ministarskoj razini, koju je vodio ministar Rudolf, i Jugoslavenska armija, koju je predstavljao admiral Jokić, sastali su se u Cavtatu 5. prosinca. Pregovori su trebali biti nastavljeni 6. prosinca.
The JNA began on early morning of December 6, 1991, conducting infantry operations with the support and aid of artillery to try to take over Mount Surge and the fort that was there. In the process, as they were conducting operations, artillery fire came from Dubrovnik in defense of the Croatian troops on Mount Surge. Because of this, at some point, the JNA forces decided to avert some of their artillery resources to firing on Dubrovnik. Later in the morning, as the infantry troops were approaching Mount Surge, they asked for the artillery fire to stop so as to not take any friendly fire, and all of the JNA resources, all of the JNA artillery resources were focused on the city of Dubrovnik, including the Old Town. And so as the fighting was happening, the JNA shelled quite heavily Dubrovnik, including the Old Town, for a time period lasting up to 11 hours.
Detonacije se me probudile. Čuli smo, već sam rekla, buku, užasno detonacije, kao da nam u glavu udara.
To je upravo bila kanonada bez prestanka. Negdje između 11 i 12 sati naša zgrada je bila pogođena. To je bila jedan strahovit udarac. Mi smo čak osjetili kako se potresla zgrada. To je kao potres možda.
Uz eksploziju vidjela se jedna svjetlost drugačija, neka malo plavičasta, jaka svjetlost. Mi smo se u tom trenutku skvrčili, smanjili smo svoj volumen na minimum i bili tiho.
Jer samo jedan detalj da vam rečem, kad jedna granata pogodila samostan male braće, gdje je stara apoteka, je od našega ulaza pa niti 10 metara. Nama se u podrumu gdje smo mi bili ugasila šterika, svijeća ona koju smo imali, koja ona je gorjela, od detonacije se ugasila, kako smo mogli i pomisliti izići negdje vanka.
Could you hear the explosions as you remained in the cellar between 6 and 3 p.m.?
Da je čovjek gluh bio, čuo bi.
Dakle, pogođena je kuća i zapalila se u roku, ja mislim, par sekundi da je to izgorilo sve. Cijeli život. Imala sam osjećaj, nisam zaplakala, ali imala sam osjećaj da sam izgubila identitet.
6. prosinca je bio najopakiji za grad unutar zidima, mi to zovemo grad, zato jer tad izgorjelo i 9 palača, palo je bezbroj projektila na Dubrovnik, na taj grad unutar zidina. Mi smo snimali taj dan, nije se moglo puno, tek negdje predvečer smo uspjeli dogurati do grada. Sjećam se zgrada u plamenu i sjećam se nešto što se dogodilo. Odjedanput su ljudi počeli, jednostavno krenuli prema gradu i odlučili spasiti to. Iako nije bilo vode, došli su gasiti.
I think it's important to note that when discussing Croatian forces in Dubrovnik, and particularly the Old Town, there was no evidence to ever show that there was a significant military force present in the Old Town, and that there was no military significance to the Old Town that would justify any military actions taken against it. Clearly, there were Croatian armed forces in Dubrovnik, and there's no question about that. But the Old Town in and of itself was viewed by the Croatians as actually not militarily viable.
Dakle, čitav je Dubrovnik granatiran i ja bih rekao brutalno. I to je granatiranje trajalo sve dok nije započelo primirje. I ja ću vam reći, eto imali smo neke sretne okolnosti, našao se tu ovaj satelitski telefon. Stupili smo u dodir s admiralom Jokićem, zaključili primirje Ja ne znam kakva bi sudbina Dubrovnika bila da sve to nismo uspjeli iskoristiti i obaviti.
We were utterly shocked at the time. I was already working at UNESCO in 1991, and it was one of the first cases where we saw this direct and intentional destruction.
Istrage o zločinima počinjenim protiv kulturne baštine u Dubrovniku počele su i prije osnivanja Međunarodnog suda za bivšu Jugoslaviju.
Well, the Commission of Experts was set up in October of 1992 to deal with some of the already most notorious violations of international law in the former Yugoslavia. And when they set it up, they hired quite a few lawyers and quite a few investigators. And they even had a special rapporteur for destruction of cultural property. And she was tasked with looking into what happened in Dubrovnik and also what happened to the old bridge in Mostar. They conducted a series of investigations. They had, I think it was 35 different field missions, one of which was to Dubrovnik. And they went to Dubrovnik, I think it was in the fall of 1993. And then in early 1994, they write up their final reports. And their final reports reached the conclusion that, there was a prima facie case to be made against the officers responsible for the shelling of Dubrovnik in 1991. All of that ended up being very useful evidence for the ICTY, which started operation right about the time the Commission of Experts finished. It was extremely useful because that was fresh evidence. They're looking at these areas right after these things happened. And had they not done that, our job years later would have been a lot more difficult.
Tribunal je 2001. godine podigao optužnice protiv 4 osobe za koje se smatralo da su najodgovornije za te zločine.
In the first place, there were 3 indictments. The first indictment was in 2001, the last was in 2003. The first indictment had 4 indictees, Kovačević, Zec, Strugar, and Jokic. Then they removed 2 of the indictees from the indictment for the second indictment. They decided not to go ahead with the case against Zec, who was a deputy, and they decided to remove Rambo Kovačević because he was found probably not fit to stand trial, and he was sent down for processing to Serbia. And that leaves Strugar and Jokic, and Jokic makes a guilty plea.
Časni sude, postoje 2 razloga zbog kojih sam danas ovdje. Prvi, to je moje lično ubeđenje da kao komandant imam moralnu i ličnu obavezu da prihvatim odgovornost i izvinjenje za postupke svojih počinjenih, čak i kada ih nisam naredio. Drugi, to je svijest o tome da je moje prihvatanje krivice i kajanje važnije od moje lične sudbine. Također, iako sam to učinio u toku samog granatiranja radioputem i nakon toga i lično, osjećam obavezu da i ovom prilikom izrazim svoje najdublje saučešće porodicama poginulih i ranjenih, kao i građanima Dubrovnika, za bol i štetu koju im je nanela jedinica pod mojom komandom.
He admitted that forces under his command shelled the old town of Dubrovnik on 6th of December 1991, and that he was aware, he also admitted that at the time he was aware of the protected status of Dubrovnik.
And we of course had the benefit of a guilty plea in relation to Dubrovnik, which was the case of Jokic. And the fact that he admitted that the Yugoslav army had directed shells into Dubrovnik, which was unjustified, provided really important evidence to break through the difficulties of trying to prove whether there was a legitimate military target involved or not.
Djokic has been convicted for the crimes of unlawful attack on civilians within the old town of Dubrovnik, for the murder of 2 persons, Tonči Skočko and Pavel Urban, in the course of the attack, and for the cruel treatment by wounding of 3 others, Nikola Jovic, Mata Vajalo and Ivo Vlasića, in the course of that same attack. He has also been convicted for devastation not justified by military necessity and for unlawful attack on civilian objects. Finally, Djokic has been convicted for destruction or willful damage done to institutions dedicated to religion, charity and education, the arts and sciences, historic monuments and works of art and science.
Yeah, and the other thing which they mentioned in the Jokic sentencing judgment after he pled guilty was that the protection given to these cultural sites was in addition to the protection given to them as civilian targets.
Osim toga, raspravno vijeće je još jednom potvrdilo načelo da napad na zaštićenu kulturnu baštinu ne pogađa samo jednu konkretnu zajednicu, već cijeli svijet.
The old town of Dubrovnik was protected not only under the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, but also as a UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Site. It was an outstanding architectural site illustrating a significant stage in human history and cultural achievement. The shelling attack on the old town was an attack not only against the history and the heritage of the region, but also against the cultural heritage of the whole of humankind.
And so you're only left with Strugar. So the last indictment deals only with Strugar.
The third case, that's probably the most interesting case, which resulted in a trial, was the case against General Pavle Strugar. He was the commander of the 2nd Operational Group of the Yugoslav National Army, which was stationed in the area covering Dubrovnik in 1991. The trial chamber established that on 6th of December 1991, forces of the 3rd Motorized Brigade of the 472nd Battalion shelled the old town of Dubrovnik. It also established that these forces, commanded directly by Kovačević, were subordinated to Admiral Jokic, who in turn was subordinated to Pavle Strugar.
And the evidence showed that what Strugar had done was to issue an order to attack a nearby geographical feature in the area of Dubrovnik, a mountain. And this feature was about 1 kilometre away from the old town of Dubrovnik. So there was no suggestion that Strugar had issued any kind of illegal order. But what the evidence showed was that this unit that ended up shelling the old town in the course of this legitimate attack was a unit that had a prior history of similarly unlawful shelling involving the old town. They'd done the same thing or a similar thing in similar circumstances in October, then again in November, and then on the 6th of December when Strugar issued his order, again the old town was shelled.
And the trial chamber also took into account that the old town was shelled in November on 2 occasions, and during this shelling cultural property was damaged. The trial chamber reason should have put him on notice that when another artillery attack is carried out, the same incidents may happen again.
Za razliku od svog nekadašnjeg podređenog admirala Jokića, general Strugar iznio je jaku obranu i pružio različita objašnjenja za štetu nanesenu Dubrovačkom starom gradu.
Zatim je naglašeno da šteta na kulturno-istorijskim spomenicima nije većih razmjera, da se ne može sa sigurnošću navesti porijeklo svih oštećenja i što je indikativno da se ne mogu imenovati počinioci, jer je očigledno da mnoga oštećenja ne potiču od napada izvan starog grada. To znači da su oštećenja nastala vjerovatno od borbi unutar starog grada.
Numerous propositions were advanced as to why the old town came to be shelled on 6 December 1991. In particular, in the course of the defence case, the view was pursued that in truth there had been little or no damage to the old town. The Chamber, however, is satisfied by the evidence there was extensive damage and that it extended over substantial areas of the old town.
Od 6 zgrada koje su izgorele 6.12. u starom gradu, 5 su se nalazili lokali u vlasništvu ili u vezi sa licima iz Srbije i Crne Gore. Odbrana u ovoj činjenici vidi više od puke koincidencije.
One other position for which the defence contended is that any damage, alternatively some of the damage, to the old town was in fact deliberately or accidentally inflicted by the Croatian defending forces or other Croatian interests. However, there is a strong body of evidence, indeed an overwhelming body, that the damage inflicted in and to the old town of Dubrovnik on 6 December 1991 was caused by the JNA shelling.
Stari grad kao kulturno-istorijski spomenik zaštićen od strane UNESCO, tokom perioda izvođenja operacija na Dubrovačko-hercegovačkom ratištu je zloupotrebljavan i korišćen u vojne svrhe. Sve to je rađeno na način da su paravojne formacije koristile stari grad i položaje u njegovoj neposrednoj blizini za provokacije i dejstva na jedinice Jugoslovenske narodne armije koje su se nalazile u blokadi Dubrovnika.
Yet a further defence submission, and one which is somewhat inconsistent with the submissions we have just been considering, is that any damage to the old town on 6 December 1991 was a regrettable but unavoidable consequence of artillery fire of the JNA targeted at Croatian military positions in and in the immediate vicinity of the old town.
Zaključci raspravnog vijeća bili su nedvojbeni.
The trial chamber went building by building, reviewed witness evidence, documentary evidence, photographic evidence to establish the extent of damage of each of these buildings. And it found that 52 buildings were actually damaged during the attack, 6 of which were completely destroyed. They were burned out by shells fired on the old town that day. The damaged or destroyed buildings included mosques, churches, a synagogue, palaces.
It is the finding of the chamber that the cause of the established damage to the old town was extensive, deliberate and indiscriminate shelling of the old town over some 10.5 hours on 6 December 1991, not only by JNA mortars, but also by other JNA weapons such as ZIS and recoilless cannons and Malutka rockets.
Well, it was hard to justify because it wasn't justifiable. They were attacking a non-military target. It was vandalism of the first order. There was little, if any, military purpose to what they were doing. It It was clearly mean-spirited, it was clearly spiteful, and it was enormously destructive. The reason it's indefensible is because it is.
Raspravno vijeće je osudilo Strugara zato što nije spriječio napad na sam Stari grad. Presudom iz srpnja 2008. godine žalbeno vijeće je proširilo opseg njegove odgovornosti.
The Child Chamber had indeed convicted Strugar of failing to prevent the attack on the Old Town, but they found that he only had a duty to act from the moment that he received a phone call saying, be aware there is an unlawful attack, unlawful shelling going on in the Old Town as we speak. And the argument that we made on appeal from the prosecution side was, well, of course it's important that from that point he take extra measures to prevent, but we think his responsibility extends far back from that. Of course our objective has to be to make sure that not a single brick in Dubrovnik was ever destroyed if we could possibly help it. So we felt that there was a really important principle underlying this, and we brought the appeal. And the appeals chamber agreed and said, indeed, any commander who's on notice of the risk of a possibility of crimes happening has to take steps to prevent that.
Au vu des constatations faites par la Chambre de première instance et que, ayant été mis en garde contre le risque d'une attaque et alerté de la nécessité d'ouvrir une enquête, Strugar avait des raisons de savoir, au sens de l'article 7.3 du statut, que ses subordonnés étaient sur le point de commettre des crimes, mais n'a rien fait pour les empêcher.
So we got a good result in the Strugar case. I think we managed to establish Strugar's responsibility in a very accurate way. But perhaps even more importantly, we set a precedent for command responsibility that will be important for the future. Because as important as the cultural heritage of the world is, of course, if you then apply this principle in a situation where there's a risk of a massacre of people, of hundreds of thousands, or even of a genocide happening, you can see how absolutely critical it is that commanders be required to control a situation, to take effective preventative measures, and to ensure as much as possible that crimes never happen.
Konzistentni napori istražitelja, tužitelja i sudaca tribunala igrali su ključnu ulogu u dovođenju zločina nad kulturnom baštinom u središte međunarodnog kaznenog prava. Praksa Međunarodnog suda razvijena u ovim predmetima prokrčila je put budućoj prevenciji i kaznenom progonu za ove zločine, počinjene i u miru i za vrijeme rata u cijelom svijetu.
I'd say it's fair to say that realizing the importance of cultural destruction is an achievement here, because it was something we came around to thinking as we worked on these cases, because we discovered that these aren't just property crimes. These are part of a bigger picture where they're trying to eliminate a culture on a certain area. It's important that we realize that, and we're able to see the connections between cultural destruction and forcible displacement and deportation and all the other terror that goes on. I think that was very important.
So the ICTY jurisprudence in fact makes it possible for destruction of cultural property to be prosecuted as an international crime when it takes place in times of peace. In other words, if cultural property is destroyed or damaged by an act of terrorism outside of an armed conflict, this act of terrorism destroying or damaging cultural property can be prosecuted as an international crime.
So I think our cases are very important from that point of view by both affirming the seriousness of property destruction, by affirming the links between property destruction and broader campaigns of crimes. We know, of course, that in particular cultural property has such symbolic value in so many communities. And so when the agenda of a warring party or an individual accused person is to remove, to permanently remove, to destroy a particular group, targeting the cultural heritage is often going to be absolutely key to that agenda. So for prosecutors to miss that and not include that as part of the facts presented to the court would really be a tragedy.
I find the case of Dubrovnik a very important case because it's case law for the future of safeguarding heritage in cases of armed conflict. It's also a case which we can mention because we are training military personnel all over the world through the 1954 convention, the so-called Hague Convention, in times of armed conflict. It's a case we can mention also when we do training on illicit trafficking of cultural objects, when we work in times of conflict to provide information on the places to be safeguarded, whether they are on the World Heritage List or tentative listings. So we can say, in the case of Dubrovnik, it was a case in front of the court, and this will happen in the future for other cases.